Thank you. Good morning. This meeting of the California High-Speed Rail Authority Board will come to order. Will the Secretary please call the roll?
Director Schenk.
Here.
Vice Chair Richards.
Here.
Director Rossi.
Here.
Director Curtin. Director Paskett.
Here.
Director Lowenthal.
Here.
Director Camacho.
Here.
Director Miller.
Here.
Senator Bell. Assemblymember Arambula.
Here.
Chair Richard.
Here. Would Vice Chair Tom Richards please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Before we start, Governor Brown has appointed a new member to our board, and that is Nancy Miller, a prominent attorney here in Sacramento. And we're very pleased with her appointment. We thank the governor. This now brings the board up to a full complement of 9 members. And Ms. Miller, welcome to the High-Speed Rail Program. And I'd like to give you the opportunity to just introduce yourself and say anything you'd like to say.
Good morning, all. I'm looking forward to serving with you, and since we have a huge agenda, I'm just going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Well, she clearly doesn't fit on this board with that level of cogent commentary, but we'll go forward. Thank you very much. Let me just try to turn down the gain on this a little bit. Okay, so as we do, we'll start with public comment. I have public comment cards here. I'll take them in the order in which they were received. So first is Jeremy Bailey from Sacramento, and followed by Rick, it looks like Ortega. Excuse me, sir. If you could come up to use the microphone, introduce yourself so we have your remarks recorded. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'll be real quick. I'm an East Sacramento resident, but my wife and her family are from France, and I just want to congratulate everybody that's working so hard. The vast majority of French people are really excited about this project and hope that you can see it to completion. I will be on another bullet train over the Christmas holidays, going to the French Alps to ski, and it's an amazing experience. And for the people, I say the naysayers and doomsdayers that are getting in the way of this project, I really would imagine that most of them have never had the experience to be on high-speed rail. And I really think it's going to revolutionize not only transportation, but especially long-distance travel in this state and then eventually in the entire country. And we're going to be a shining example in the progressiveness of California throughout the history of this country. So I just appreciate, I wanted to say that. I really appreciate all the hard work and all the extra hours that I know everybody's probably, some of you are putting in to see this to completion.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Is it Mr. Ortega? Did I get your name correct? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Rick Ortega. I'm the General Manager of the Grassland Water District and Resource Conservation District. I appreciate the opportunity. The Grasslands Wetland Complex in Merced County, notably the size of Manhattan, represents the largest remaining block of wetlands in the western United States. With only 5% of our interior wetlands remaining in California, protecting the last remaining is really imperative. Annually, the single largest concentration of overwintering waterfowl are found on Earth, are found in the Central Valley on these wetlands, the heart of which is the grassland ecological area. Because millions of birds depend on the ecological area each year, it is designated as a wetland of global importance under the International Ramsar Convention, the Western Hemispheric Shorebird Reserve Network, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Audubon Society. The current proposed San Jose to Merced alignment bisects the grassland ecological area and specifically Mud Slough, a major and critical wildlife corridor linking the North and South grasslands. My board of directors has formally requested a below-grade design through this critical wildlife corridor. I strongly urge you to accommodate this request.
Thank you, Mr. Ortega. Our next speaker is Ellen Weir, also of the Grasslands Water District, and she'll be followed by Paul Guerrero. Good morning, Ms. Weir.
Good morning, board members. My name is Ellen Weir. I'm the General Counsel for the Grassland Water District. The district has been involved with this project from the start. We obtained strong commitments to mitigate the effects of bisecting our wetland complex, and we're taking every meeting we can with your staff. We're committing our resources, and we're doing whatever it takes to see that the commitments will be met. To be honest, it's been a very slow and cumbersome process. If we're going to properly address and mitigate the impacts of bisecting the largest remaining wetland on the West Coast, we need to do it together, and we need to do it now. We have concerns about the decision to use a biological model rather than working with our district to conduct on-the-ground biological surveys. We're very worried about noise impacts. We're also worried about bird strikes and lighting. We've seen very little movement on the development of a plan to obtain 10,000 acres of conservation easements as promised in the programmatic EIR for the project. So we came today to introduce ourselves to you. We'll be reaching out further in the weeks to come, and we look forward to sitting down with you to have further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Weir. Paul Guerrero, followed by Diana Lacombe.
You should be getting 2 copies of this right here. One is the San Francisco to San Jose leg, and the other is the San Jose to Merced leg. I hope that you have them up there.
Secretary is distributing those.
Thank you. Good morning. The handouts, your handouts tell us that on November 23rd, 2015, the authority executed a contract with HNTB to act as the engineering and environmental consultant for the San Francisco to San Jose and San Jose to Merced project legs. On or about August 16th last year, I asked the board about 2 environmental justice studies which you have in front of you for the San Francisco to San Jose and San Jose to Merced portions of the project. There's 2 studies, but for a few minor differences are identical. If you look at the contents, you'll note that their contents are basically identical. The studies were prepared by Kearns and West, not HNTB. And you should have the first 3 pages of each study there. Staff took the floor after I spoke and told the board I was mistaken. You hadn't commissioned any environmental studies, and the 2 studies were marked confidential for internal use only. Today, staff is asking for additional funding for a study staff last year claimed was never done. The question I asked you in August about those studies was if the authority considers itself the banker, and I have heard this many times that the authority is the banker for the San Francisco to San Jose leg. If you're the banker, then why is the authority, as opposed to Caltrain, contract for engineering and environmental studies? Caltrain, the owner of the San Francisco to San Jose leg, is responsible for the engineering and environmental studies, not the banker authority. Why open yourself up to additional lawsuits and liability when that burden belongs to Caltrans? All the lawsuits that come over the environmental studies, Caltrans should be taken care of, not the high-speed rail. Finally, in closing, San Jose citizens have asked and have been told that the EJ studies will come after the route has been picked. La Raza Roundtable has never been contacted concerning an EJ study, and I've heard that the La Raza Lawyers Association were discussing a lawsuit against the authority. This is the time to start working with the minority community in the San Jose area. It comprises almost 70% of the population down there. 50% are Hispanic, I believe, and somewhere around 20% are Asian. La Raza is the largest organization down there, and we've never been contacted by anybody regarding an environmental justice study or any other studies. We have a member, Danny Garza, who sits on your steering committee, but that was a labor to get somebody on there that was Hispanic. So I'm asking you to reach out to the community down there, have your staff start reaching out to the community and working with the community, not just the upper middle class and white section of the community, the rich people, but come down to the people and work with the people whose homes you're going through with the train. Start discussing it with them and get them involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Guerrero. Ms. Lacombe?
Good morning, Chairman Richard, members of the board, Mr. Felenz. I'm Diana Lacombe, president of APAC. Last month, I took a trip to the East Coast, and I managed to take a train ride on Amtrak from Boston to Maine. So on the Amtrak train, I was touting how the California high-speed rail is, you know, the largest, the only high-speed rail in the country. And someone in the train pops up and says, "That's not true." And I said, "Oh, is there another one?" And they said, "Yes, it's the Northeast Corridor high-speed rail. That was the first one from DC to Boston." But I know that in a lot of the literature that's posted, it says that we're the first. We may be the largest, but apparently not the first. Okay. The second area that I wanted to mention is I saw that there's contract amendments to AT&T and PG&E for utility relocation. They're also going to be receiving additional funding. I was here before the board, I believe it was in February of this year, asking for your assistance in making it a little bit easier for our small businesses to get contracts with the utilities, specifically on the high-speed rail project. And so that request, again, I'm repeating today. And I know there has been some action on it, but from what I gather, not to a great extent. So any help would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lacombe. That concludes the... I'll come back to that. Yeah, I will. That concludes the public comments section. Thank you all for taking your time to come and appear before us today. So we'll move on now to the regular agenda. But first, Ms. Shank wanted me to point out that, in fact, the Northeast Corridor is it's faster than traditional Amtrak, but it's nowhere close to the speeds that true high-speed rail around the world has. So they may be, no.
125.
Yeah, they can
And
maybe
no
hit
dedicated
150 for about
and
5 seconds.
Yeah.
Right.
And no dedicated track.
Right, yeah. Okay, first item is the minutes.
Move approval.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved by Director Schenk, seconded by Director Lowenthal. Would the Secretary please call the roll?
Director Schenk,
Yes.
Vice Chair Richards, Director Rossi, Director Paskett, Director Lowenthal,
Yes.
Director Camacho,
Yes.
Director Miller,
Abstain.
Chair Richard.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Minutes are adopted. Item 2 is consideration of an augmentation for the contingency fund for a CP1 design build contract. Mr. Tapping, good morning.
Good morning, Chairman Richard and board members. My pleasure to be before you today. I am here to request an augmentation of $35 million to the CP1 construction contract contingency. This is really technically an internal budget transfer between provisional sums that were provided at the initial stage of the project, which we estimate will not be used to the capacity that was originally estimated. As a way of background, CP1 contingency was initially $165 million. Through recent finance and audit meetings and board meetings, we've explained some of the risks that are associated with that project, primarily the right-of-way acquisition risks, third-party agreement risks, and railroad agreement risks. And some of these risks have been realized. We've taken aggressive steps to mitigate these risks. However, they have depleted the contingency. So this is a short-term request while we undergo a more robust, risk-informed contingency assessment that is currently underway. We're looking at not only CP1, but we're looking at CP23, CP4, and in fact the whole program in terms of informing the 2018 business plan. So that process is underway and well underway. And we're also looking at opportunities and cost savings, and we're having workshops in those regards. So this is a short-term request to keep the critical construction of this project moving in terms of the critical areas of construction that are underway now, the 14 areas of construction, and some of the change orders that are appropriate and need to be executed as we move forward. So as way of background on the provisional sums, there are two provisional sums. There are more provisional sums, but the two that were looked at exhaustively in terms of estimating and use were one called the construction contract work. And that was originally set up for right-of-way and dealing with adjacent property owners. And looking at the projections and the burn rates, very little money has been spent out of that contingency. And staff has done an analysis looking forward and does not anticipate spending the full amount. In fact, they're looking at less than $5 million for that one. The utility also contingency is not the big risk that we're seeing with PG&E, AT&T. It is those utilities that is under the control of the contractor. He is to relocate the facilities. Given the progress of that work to date and looking at the forward projections, there also appears to be conclusively an estimate not to exceed $5 million. So the request is to basically augment the $35 million, do this technical transfer from the provisional sums, and in the long term, as we complete our risk-informed and opportunity risk analysis that is ongoing, to follow up that request, this request at that time.
Are there questions for Mr. Tapping?
Yeah, I have a couple.
I think Director Schenk was first.
That's all right. No, go ahead, Mike.
Okay.
You're always enlightening.
Okay, I'm going to try. So these monies are being transferred to the contingency fund,
Correct.
and then you're going to spend them.
Yes.
So why are they going to the contingency fund? We shouldn't be
Well,
spending,
like-
I mean, we shouldn't be spending money out of the contingency fund.
Well, we anticipate, Mike, some change orders ongoing that will need to be executed, and the contingency funds will be the source for the change order.
So that means that the contract wasn't appropriate, and we have now found out that the contract wasn't appropriate, and we're putting these extra monies in to cover that shortfall of whatever the contract was, and instead of putting it into the, instead of setting it up to the contract, we're putting it into the contingency fund, because otherwise we'd have to draw from the contingency fund anyhow.
Correct.
Okay, well then let's go to the next, let's go to page 4, John, where it talks about budget and fiscal impact. The last line says, so there's going to be more of this? on this contract?
That's correct, Mike. We're doing a continuing risk-informed analysis on this and other projects, consistent with moving towards the 2018 business plan and our updated estimates.
So how was this original budget item presented to this board? Was it presented as this was a contract for cost to complete?
No, this was presented, the original contingency was presented to the board.
It's not a contingency, I'm talking about the contract. The contract that we are now going to transfer funds to in order to meet the overages in it.
Yes.
They may be going to the contingency, but that's not how the contingency was approved. How was the contract approved?
It was approved by, it was basically best value design build procurement method, which was a combination of price and qualifications.
So we missed it considerably. That's what this tells me. Is that correct?
This tells us that we have some risks and we have some change orders, which, you know, we've discussed at length. Yes, correct.
Okay. I don't know if that was enlightening, Lynn, but I'm done.
All right, Director Schenck, then Director Pascat.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, if you'll indulge me, my comments are, they're not questions, they're comments really about this agenda item, and it goes on to the next two agenda items. Look, outcomes have many causes, and I know we've come to this moment with a lot of different decisions that have occurred, some even before this administration. So it's not a matter of looking at fault, but I just say, as I said on the phone when you all did the briefing, and by the way, it was an excellent briefing. I thank the staff for taking this time to do that. That my concern and my discomfort level is that while this is short-term cash flow kinds of decisions that need to be made, you know, in the big picture for the public, for our stakeholders, where we don't frankly have, you know, a great deal of goodwill or confidence in us, this sort of shell game of moving money around, where we know we're going to eventually, especially items 3 and 4, we're eventually going to have to come up with the money that we're moving around. I understand here in item 2 that we might not have to go back and refund utilities or the construction contract work provisional fund, but in the next two items, we will. It seems to me that we have a bigger public relations communications issue that we must be more transparent, that we must really have a simpler way of doing this so that the public can understand it. So it doesn't look like, oh, we were caught up short, because I know we were not caught up short. You know, we made some of these decisions when we didn't have all of the information that we have today. You know, we had good guesstimates, but still, you know, we have a credibility issue, and rather than just dealing with sort of the cash flow, we have to tell the full story and find a better way of doing it. And I know from the conversations that we had at the staff level that you are looking at a better way of doing it. But this just, I mean, I'll vote for it, but it leaves me tremendously uncomfortable in the way it appears. And I think that you understand that from the conversations that we've had. So it's not really a question, it's just sort of an overall comment, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Schenck. Ms. Pascat?
Yes.
Button. That's counterintuitive. I have similar sentiments as Director Schenck, and then in listening to Director Rossi's questions, I also have similar questions. And so I'm a little uncomfortable with the information in the packet, and I apologize for missing the briefing prepared by staff, but it feels like there should be more information presented to us with this request to augment the contract. And the other piece that grabbed my attention is the risk analysis. And maybe if there is an effort right now to do a risk analysis and put together a plan to mitigate those risks on this contract, it would be more appropriate to represent this to us after we've also heard in more detail, the plan to mitigate those risks. So I'm wondering, and you can tell me if there's a sense of urgency because of a cash flow issue, but I'm wondering if it makes sense to get more information and bring it back to us and then let us vote on this at the next meeting.
There is an urgency with regard to cash flow on this project. We can certainly come back to you with a presentation on the robust risk mitigations that we're doing. For example, on the right-of-way, we are working with a contractor to focus on critical parcels to keep the project proceeding in looking at our critical path method and moving forward. So there is a robust list of risk mitigations, but the nature of the cash needs on this project at this time, I would recommend that we move forward.
You done? Director Camacho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would echo the issues that Director Schenck has raised, but it seems to me that we are perhaps dealing with the symptom rather than the problem. We establish a budget. We exceed that budget for some reason. I think that in the discussion portion of the recommendation that's being made to us, you talk about right-of-way acquisition, and I would hope that we will deal with the problem. We talk about environmental permits, third-party agreements, those types of things, and I would hope that the next legislative session that we approach the legislature for relief in this area to accommodate us so that we don't have these problems. But we continue to kick the can down the road, and we continue to kick it every single time. And in some cases, we've kicked it 3 times. So it doesn't make any sense or it makes a lot of sense that people lack the confidence in our ability to be transparent in the things that we're doing, and certainly manage a budget and a project. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. And I certainly want to associate myself with those remarks. Other directors have questions? Director Miller?
How about that?
There you go.
Okay. Since I'm new, I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions. It looks to me like this request is due to some design changes and litigation that occurred since 2013 when your original design build contract was issued. Is that correct?
Yes, partially.
And those deal with City of Fresno and Union Pacific issues where they benefited by some of these changes?
Correct.
And then you had litigation, which resulted in some changes you also had to make. Is that right?
Correct.
When you do your risk management, I mean, in design build, as I understand it, you're designing as you go, because you're not really sure completely. You don't have specs for people to bid on. You were basically designing, and as I understand this, you didn't have right-of-way, you didn't have environmental, and so, but you had construction funds, so you committed to construction with the design build to kind of go forward and start the process. Is that right?
We did advance the project.
So I think given that, I mean, this is CP1, and so I just understand the fact that when you start like that, you're definitely going to have changes because you don't know going in what your right-of-way, what your litigation may be, and what your partners, meaning your city, your local, the railroad, are going to want or need in order for you to proceed through their jurisdiction.
Those are all risks to the project that we assess when we put out the project.
Right.
But there's certainly uncertainty to those risks.
So I think that Director Rossi, do we call ourselves directors?
I don't, but you can.
What?
Just
Okay.
call me Mike.
Okay, what Mike said was, it's not really contingency because you're going to spend it right away. But I did ask this question, which is, what is the percentage of contingency so far on the project? And I heard it was approximately 20%. Is that right?
That's approximately correct.
Is that just for CP1 or is that?
It is.
Okay.
And the other CPs are in this similar magnitude.
All right. And
Excuse me, she asked a question, and your answer, I thought, was different than what I understood. She asked, is that just for CP1? I thought the contingency on CP1 was not 20%.
It was initially 16%. With this augmentation, it would go to 19%.
Okay, but just so clarity for her question, initially the contingency, prior to this, the contingency is not 20% though, right?
It was not. It was not.
Okay, I'm sorry, Ms. Miller, I just wanted.
CP1 was the only one.
Yeah.
CP1 was 16% initially.
I'm saying it's the only one that wasn't 28.
That was the only one that wasn't 20%.
CP23 was, I believe, 19, and CP4 was in the neighborhood of 18.
Right.
As I recall.
Apologize.
so to me, we're getting closer to the contingencies that you had on the other, that you have on the other two, or maybe exceeding it by 1%. So just for me coming in new, I mean, I understand we have some financial and funding issues with this project, obviously, but this does not trouble me in terms of once you start a design build and then having to deal with your partners and making changes as a result of that, that you would be somewhere in this percentage of contingency. Now, I don't know whether CP1 you're anticipating a lot more contingency requests. That would be my next question. But I don't have trouble with this.
We are undertaking that analysis now, along with all the other CPs.
Okay, thank you.
Other directors? So I'll just add, first of all, I think the questions from the board members were good, and my only impression on this is I think one of our most effective management tools is managing against the contingency. So that we establish a contingency. One of the things that I've always respected about the way that you've approached this is that we haven't just used a flat number, that basically, if I understand it correctly, the contingencies that we establish on each of these legs come from the risk assessment analyses that you do, so that it's not just some average number, but it's supposed to be driven against the risks that we see. And then I've always been appreciative of the fact that at Finance and Audit and ultimately at the board, we're able to look at the draw against those contingencies as one of our major management tools for staying on top of the progress of the project. So really my only discomfort with this was just the telescoping collapse in time between the establishment of the contingency against the drawdown. Because what that says is we're essentially moving the goalposts with the draw as opposed to staying ahead of this and saying, this is where we see the contingency and we can see these things that are eroding the contingency. So I'm not going to even ask you to comment on that, but I think it goes back to what Ms. Schenk said at the beginning about transparency. It just seems that we should be way ahead of the curve in always updating and understanding what the contingency needs to be on these, and that we draw against that, and that we, I mean, as a layperson, that I have a sense that, okay, we're 80% of the way through a project, for example, and we've only drawn 40% of the contingency, that sounds good. If the obverse is true, that we're 40% of the way through and drawn 80% of the contingency, then that's obviously cause for concern.
Just in fairness, not necessarily. Maybe it may depend on where the complexities are.
Yeah, that's right. If you've just done the most complex part and then the rest of it is just cruising, that's right. But in any case, that we have a sense, is probably a better way for me to say it, of where we are in terms of the progress versus how much contingency we have remaining. So that's my only comment, and I'm not being critical, is just to say that I agree with Ms. Schenk that I think we want these contingency determinations to really be moving, far ahead of the draw against them.
I would agree, and we're moving towards being more proactive in that regard.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, may I-
Yes,
Thank you.
Vice Chairman Richards.
I don't know if that's working or not. No? How about no? No? I have nothing to say.
Here.
You want to use mine?
Thank you.
We can go to lunch.
So, thank you. So, John, I think that to some extent, it's the presentation doesn't help here. I think that can be improved upon. I think that we need to call things exactly what they are, as opposed to moving from one thing to another, when in fact it does really lead right to what the real issue is. It is an overrun. I think that the issue when you provide part of the information on these other major change orders without explanation, I don't recall, and maybe we should, but these are major items also, but in the drawdown of the 160 or so, and there's 110 of it right there, the dates that it occurred, who authorized the change order, and if it's the board, it could say that, but that information would be helpful, not only to the board as we're looking at this with some degree of disparity between the time that the change orders were incurred and now that we're looking at them, along with just a clear explanation of what we're doing here, because as Director Schenck and all of my colleagues have mentioned, I think we've all had the same reaction to this. I think some of it could be improved substantially through the presentation, but also I'm concerned a bit about what's missing, so that we've got a better understanding, as does the public, with regards to this $110 million of additional change orders that we don't really know what they mean and who authorized them and when they actually occurred.
Okay, we can provide that information.
I'll move it.
Okay, moved by Director Rossi,
Second.
seconded by Vice Chair Richards. The Secretary, please call the roll.
Director Schenck,
Yes.
Vice Chair Richards,
Yes.
Director Rossi,
Yes.
Director Paskett, Director Lowenthal,
Yes.
Director Camacho,
Yes.
Director Miller, Chair Richard.
Yes. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Okay, our next item is consideration of an amendment to the environmental and engineering contract for the San Francisco, San Jose, and San Jose Merced project sections for HNTB. I'm presuming most of this is for Maureen Hayes' salary at HNTB, is that right?
Sure. I'll make one disclosure. I have a boot on my foot, so that's what happens when you run in with our auditor. Can't. I'll make sure I don't do that again.
Very good.
Did you just steal her only joke for the quarter?
I want to be ahead of that.
Yeah. Okay.
So, good morning, Chairman and members of the board. Mark McLaughlin, I'm the Director of Environmental Services for the Authority. I want to present on item number 3 for the HNTB contract. I want to go over a little bit of history here for context. So the High-Speed Rail awarded HNTB our E&E contract in November of 2015 with our 30% goal. And we also authorized HNTB to initiate the technical work in March for both NorCal sections, San Francisco to San Jose and San Jose to Merced. Currently, without additional funding, the HNTB contract will be exhausted by November of this year. And HNTB has estimated the cost to complete for both rods and all permitting PE for P, which is project engineering for procurement for San Francisco, San Jose, and San Jose Merced, and also stakeholder outreach would require an amendment of a total of $39.6 million. HNTB also in this context would prepare the PEP for the Central Valley Y at about $4.8 million at a future date. As again, an advancement of the amendment of the $10 million will advance the work on both rods for these two sections and maintain momentum. It would also raise the current value to not to exceed of $46 million. and with the expenditure priorities to be determined with the executive committee and or consistent with board direction of the 2016 business plan. Also, the $10 million, we're reducing the existing Kleinfelder geotechnical contract by $10 million to fund this $10 million amendment. And then future amendments to complete permitting and PE4P for these two sections will be forthcoming as the program goes through its baseline exercise. Some major changes that have included for both sections on the alignment have changed. I'll just go through a few of them here. We currently have a San Luis Reservoir avoidance alignment developed to avoid significant water habitat and refuges and parks, including the San Luis Reservoir owned by the Bureau of Reclamation, Morgan Hill Bypass, Caltrain Peninsula Corridor electrification project in the San Francisco-San Jose section for rail alignment. There's a short viaduct north of Diridon Station to I-880 was developed in response to comments during scoping of the section. Also, the Newhall neighborhood of San Jose. Also, another aerial change this time at HSR through the Diridon Station, introduced the aerial alignment as part of that project. Modification of at-grade alignments through San Jose Diridon from analysis, and then a low viaduct downtown Gilroy Station. So the team led by Ben Trapos is working pretty diligently with stakeholders in this area that warrant these changes. We have some other pending issues on the section, or these two sections, ongoing discussions with Caltrain, SPRR in the corridor owners, and then we also have wildlife crossing issues at Soap Lake in the San Joaquin Valley and the Coyote Valley areas. And we've also been working closely with the environmental community, government-to-government consultation with Native Americans in this section, and then including water districts and the resource agencies. So the investment in this section, HNTB contract, aligns with the 2016 business plan direction and getting to valley as a state's priority. So of note, we've made also lots of progress, so I'd like to note that also that the team is working on. We're very close to concurrence of what we call Checkpoint B with the Army Corps and the US EPA in our checkpoint process, and that is the approval of a range of alternatives that would be put into the EIR EISs. So we're getting close to the concurrence to move forward with the document. Also, so that's very important. Also, this for those two sections, the deliverables by June that are targeted are for San Francisco to San Jose. In this amendment would be a draft PEPD, which is our engineering record set that supports the environmental document, and a draft admin EIR EIS to get to that point by June. San Jose Merced, again, is PEPD, which is the draft, the record set, full record set, and then the draft administration for the admin for EIR EIS for FRA review. So those are the deliverables that we're targeting to get us to June that we would see and then move forward as the program would be in the baseline based upon what direction we would be providing. So with that, we would ask for approval to maintain momentum in these two sections to attaining the rods for the valley-to-valley section.
I'm going to exercise chair's prerogative and ask a question first ahead of my colleagues, which I don't normally do, but I just want to pick up on what Nancy Miller asked before. Setting aside this particular item, Mark, can you help me think about how we're doing all this? Because we start off on things to do an environmental analysis. As we go through that, information becomes available, whether it's community impacts and people want us to look at aerial as opposed to at grade, or things that come up. We heard from the folks with the Grasslands District this morning. They want us to look at below grade. I mean, so as we start doing those things, and then we end up kind of churning, it seems to me, maybe that's a wrong word, but a lot of different environmental permutations on this. Then we go back and we say, well, now these are the things that have changed, so we're looking at these. But at some point, they'll come to the board in the form of a draft EOR, record for decision, EIR, and we may say, well, wait a minute, like we did in Bakersfield, we actually think there's a different alternative here because maybe we're looking at cost pressures or we're looking at things like that. How do we avoid getting into kind of a constant do loop on this environmental analysis? I mean, it's kind of shocking to me, the level of numbers that we deal with in terms of the environmental review costs that, you know, are just very, very, very large, and which isn't to say that we shouldn't be examining all the impacts on communities and biota and all that, but I'm just sitting here wondering, do we have any ability to control this, or are we just going to be consistently buffeted as we go through this process by people saying, well, wait, it can't go here, it has to go there, and so now we have to go back and look at all this stuff? How do you think about that, and how should we think about that?
Well, the way I think about it is that we are trying to be proactive in where the alignments are and with working with the teams that we have, but we're generally in the reaction mode, reacting to changes and requests to the project to accommodate any changes, whether those are political, those are engineering, resource agencies. And I go back to also, we have a program document and a program alignment. So we have a pretty strong framework of where we want to go and how we want to get there. And we start getting down to the either smaller levels of the analysis. So the program document is not new. And so we get down to these other little areas, and then we have different changes in the political landscape, what people want, and that's what we react to. Whether it's an engineering feasibility that wasn't foreseen, or all kinds of different things, 4F issues as it relates to a park or a recreation topic. And so we're reacting to what the project program needs, or providing environmental constraints to those and alternatives. We do provide, if there's analysis and change, is there any environmental constraints to those topics and those alternatives? That would be costly or less costly. Picking an alternative could be more costly environmentally than it would be engineering.
So not for today, but I would just like us to, I'll direct this to Mr. Falens, but I'd like us to take a breather at some point and step back and look at what we've learned so far from this process. I mean, I'm one who started off thinking that design build is the way to go, but you know, if in fact what's happening is that it just becomes kind of a floating crap game where we never really know where we are, that, you know, I think we're at the point now far enough along in CP1 and the valley construction and or first construction segment in the valley and what we've learned. I just think it would be good to step back and say, okay, can we think strategically about how this is going and whether there are ways to make this more efficient? Because it strikes me that this becomes a huge cost driver, not just for individual contracts like this that are doing the analysis, but cost driver because we end up chasing our tail on the environmental, and we have to go back on the engineering, and we have to go back on the right-of-way and everything because of all this. And so I just think this is a good time for us to take a strategic reassessment of how we can do this in the context of the laws and the things that we have to do, how we can do it more efficiently.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, Mr. Chairman, is take a look at this and come with a report back to the board.
Okay. Mr. Rossi, and then we'll go down the line for questions.
Okay. Along the lines, Mark, of what Lynn said and what Dan just said, one of the problems I have with this presentation is we've made a number, it appears, changes in looking at alternatives. And, you know, I'm getting old. Some people would say I've long past gotten, I'm old. And I can't remember who approves all these changes, or who in effect approves spending additional monies to do additional studies before we actually have a decision at a level that says, look, we only have so much money, we're only going to do so many things, we can't do 6 different alternative studies. So, Mr. Falens, as you look at that, would you also look at that process so I can understand that? Because when I read a request for more money that elucidates a series of alternatives, I'm not sure who's controlling that exercise. And it is a dollar exercise, and it is a time exercise, time to complete, which means that we're increasing costs as we sit.
Yeah,
If you would add that to that, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. Happy to do it.
And as you point out, when schedules change and move out, there's a cost implication.
Right. Thank you, Mark.
Ms. Miller?
Yes, just, the original contract was 36 million, is that right?
Yes,
And you're asking for an additional 10 today
to get us through June, correct.
to get you through June, but eventually you're going to need, you think, an additional 39.6?
Correct.
Is that on top of the 10?
No, 29 cents.
So it's 29,
Correct.
right? Okay,
39, including the 10.
including the 10. And that would get you to
Rod.
the rod, right? Okay, so with these alternatives the additional alternatives, did you drop any alternatives that you had before?
We modified the existing ones that we had. Not sure we dropped any major ones. Interesting thing about San Jose Merced is it's more of a one alignment with variations in between of one alignment, especially as you go through Pacheco Pass. There's only so many ways to go through there. We have variations of one alignment, not separate and distinct alignments.
So I'm sorry I just,
Okay.
because I'm new, I just want to ask this question. Lots of times when you go through that, you start your engineering, because there's a lot of engineering work associated with these different alternatives. Are you on top of the fact that if something looks infeasible, you stop that engineering work
Yes.
right away, and then you move on to the more feasible?
Yes.
As a way of,
Sometimes that's an increase in cost, or it could be a reduction.
it should be a reduction, if you can manage it, right? I mean, obviously, design is, but these are project level environmental documents, right? They're not program level.
That's correct.
Okay.
And we're at 15% design to support the document in light of the design build approach.
At 15?
Yes.
All right. Thanks, that's all I have. Sorry, I had one other thing.
Sure.
The 10 million that's coming from your geotechnical, do you expect to have to supplement that at some point in the future? Or is
For
that
the
a true saving?
For the geotech?
Yeah.
I would imagine, I'm not managing that contract, but that had a certain scope to complete, and they may ask for additional scope based upon supporting the procurement, the PE for P effort for that section.
So we're just shifting that at this point?
That's correct,
Thank you.
depending on the priorities of what the board sets in baseline and business plan.
But once again, the goal is to get these documents completed.
That's right. And I think I wanted to make sure to note in the original estimates or the original approach of HNTB and the procurement in 15-16, there were lots of assumptions that were made that we could use a lot of the existing PTG information, the existing engineering. San Jose Merced went dark for a couple of years. We didn't work on that very much on that section because the focus was in different areas. And then to restart that up in another procurement. And then a lot of assumptions on streamlining were looked at as why the original cost was at a certain amount. And that's why, and those necessarily, some things have worked, some things have not in those assumptions.
Ms. Miller, are you done? Or-
I'm done, thanks.
Okay. I just didn't want to cut you off. I didn't. No, that's all right. Ms. Pescat, did I miss you? Did you have a question?
No, I'm fine. In fact, I like coming behind Ms. Miller. She asked all my questions. So I get a little break today.
You could ask them again. We could have stereo.
Thank you.
Okay, coming down this way, Ms. Shank.
Well, I think I made my points earlier.
Okay.
And I move the item.
Wait, hold
Mr.
on a
Chair.
second. Your colleague, Mr. Camacho,
Oh,
would like to
sorry.
ask a question first.
Thank you. It seems as though that we continue to manage the cash flow, not the project. And we are, again, robbing Peter to pay Paul. What is the impact that it has on Kleinfelder?
What's the last question, the impact on?
Kleinfelder.
Oh, they will reduce I'm assuming they would reduce their scope. If they had X work plan, they would reduce that work plan based upon lesser priorities of what, they have a work plan, a priority of locations, I'm sure. So it would reduce their work plan.
By reducing their contract, are you confident that they will have enough money to accomplish any work that's not completed? Or are you going to come back to us again and ask to amend that too?
That's, I think, the plan, if required, that, I don't know if you want to answer that, but the goal
Sorry?
would be to complete, if we could come back as part of the, whatever the baselining is and the business plan, if it's appropriate to finish that and come back for that same amount.
So once again, we'll come back to it again. We're kicking this can down the road. I support the idea that HNTB needs to do the work. I disagree on the solution.
Did I understand Ms. Miller's question to you to indicate, I thought your answer to her was that you expected that there would probably be a scope change requested by Kleinfelder for the geotech work?
If we're reducing, generally, if we're reducing a scope in their work plan, there would come back a possibility to come back and replace that work plan. Depend on who's managing that, if the reduced work plan would support the PE for P effort or not.
So, could I just ask a quick question in furtherance of what Director, then why aren't we doing the same thing we did in the prior contract? Why aren't we just increasing the contingency in the program and taking the money against it, as opposed to taking it from the Kleinfelder contract that we suspect is going to come back and re-up? Maybe you didn't make that decision, but let me ask that question of somebody.
If I could try to explain. There is no particular contingency, there is no contingency assigned to these environmental clearance contracts.
Because they're not part of the CP1 construction contract.
Right.
Okay.
Correct. Their environmental clearance and their budget is really the amount of the contract value that was approved by the board. To the extent that there's additional scope added or changes were made that increased the cost of doing the work, then we would have to come back to the board to have an augmentation of that contract because there is no contingency that's approved by the board to draw from.
Okay, but with all due respect, until Director Miller asked the question, I guess I just assumed that the Kleinfelder contract had been budgeted for more than was needed, and so we were able to harvest some savings from that to offset the cost growth here. But in fact, it sounds like the trajectory of that contract is that that's only a temporary situation. And as a consequence, this goes back, and look, I'm not trying to grind on the staff here. I don't think anybody is. But it goes back to the initial comments of Ms. Schenk, which is we've got to just be transparent about it. If we know that the trajectory is that overall the area under the curve is going to expand, we just need to say that.
Yes, I agree. And the reason for doing this is it's a timing issue so that the Kleinfelder work and the cost of that work is out in time.
But that's a cash flow question.
Correct.
That's not a budget question.
Correct. It's a cash flow.
So we should just be clear about those two things.
Mr. Chair, if I can jump in a little bit, because it does feel like we're grinding on staff a little bit. It does say that in the resolution, that it's likely to increase. Okay. The costs are likely to increase. And I had questions around that because I was looking at the contract amount in the addition, listened to the presentation. But after Ms. Miller's questions, I think that Mark answered to my satisfaction the amounts, but it's also in the document in our resolution saying that we should expect an increase. And it's a little unsettling as a board to see an iterative process where we don't have complete visibility into the expenses, but the nature of these projects are such that I would rather have the staff come back to us incrementally when there are changes and present them, maybe with a little more data, so we have context, but check in with us along the way, because there are so many unexpected changes when you're going through CEQA and NEPA. No, so I don't want the staff to feel like we are overly critical and expect you to crystal ball everything. And I actually appreciate the continuous check-in, even though it feels like the target's moving a little bit.
Questions are fair, of course.
Look, I would. Am I on now?
Yeah.
I think we have to be careful here in that I think the staff's doing exactly what they should do. They're managing their cash. they're not pushing anything out, but they have time to deal with the other issue, and that's what they're doing. They're taking time to figure out how to deal with it, and it may not be a problem in the future, and there may be other things they can do with the existing contract. But if we just keep pumping up numbers, then there is no incentive to get better. So by maintaining a firm grasp of our cash flow, they're working very hard to try and match the timing and the needs and stay within budget. I think they're to be applauded.
Okay. And
I would agree.
thank you for Lorraine, because
Mr. Chairman, isn't there?
Read the resolution well enough. Mr. Camacho, I cut you off before, and I
Go ahead.
apologize. So
Sorry. I'm sorry. Isn't there an overall contingency in the program as opposed to just a project?
Yes.
So your comment about using that contingency to offset this, can't we do that?
There are contingencies that the board has approved for the design build contracts. There are no contingencies for environmental clearance that came to the board for approval. Instead, there are just contract amounts that come to the board for approval. So to the extent that there needs to be an additional money, the staff doesn't have access to additional funds, which typically would be contingency. So you could add contingency to the environmental program, from which, after board approval, from which the staff draws from under certain conditions. So we could arrange it differently, but presently that's how it is set up.
Yeah, I think what you were referring to is we generally think in terms of we have $11 billion or whatever of quote-unquote contingency. But that's a theoretical number as opposed to a specific number of dollar contingency out of allocated funds that exist that we apply to specific segments. I think I've got that right.
That's right. You want to be careful, as you said earlier.
It's probably not worth listening to anyhow, but the fact is that you want to be careful how you use that unallocated contingency so that you don't end up somewhere down the road with no contingency. So you need to manage every day your cash flow vis-a-vis your budget and the timing in which you need that cash flow, which means that the staff is actively trying to manage their cash flow situation vis-a-vis the budget. And personally, I would not want to see that change. We've been there before.
Okay, other questions, or are we ready for, I'm sorry? Moved by Director Pascat. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Seconded by Director Lowenthal. Secretary, please call the roll.
Director Schenk,
Yes.
Vice Chair Richards,
Yes.
Director Rossi,
Yes.
Director Pascat,
Yes.
Director Lowenthal,
Yes.
Director Camacho,
No.
Director Miller,
Yes.
Chair Richard.
Yes. Okay. Next item, same topic for the Central Valley Y for contract with Parsons Transportation Group.
Yes.
Mr. McLaughlin.
Yes, this is the same approach, and I'll go through a little bit and some assumptions, and then also deliverables in that approach. So for context and history, PTG began this work on the Central Valley Y under the San Jose Merced project section originally for $55 million in December of 2008, and its contract was suspended in 2012, having spent $44.5 million. PTG received a task order for authorization for remaining balance of the current contract, now valued at $77.24 million, in July of this year. Without additional funding, PTG again will exhaust its capacity in October of this year. And so that's a little bit of context on the contract portion, that the original Y portion was housed in the San Jose Merced contract, and when the Y was broken out, it was separated. But the contract value amount still remains the same, the total. The original contract, again, for $55 million for preliminary engineering and then project-specific environmental work, was again from San Jose Merced. In April of 2013, we studied additional alternatives in the Y for environmental clearance to be included in the checkpoint B of our Integration 404-408 MOU with the Corps and the EPA. In June of 2014, there was additional public outreach to address comments and concerns raised by the community and agencies, resulting in additional engineering and environmental work to address those comments. That was in June of 14. June of 2016, an additional alternative, SR 152 Road 11 was added and revised. So to add that as a PPA, the board acted on that previously on the preliminary preferred alternative as 152 to Road 11. So major changes since that period of time. We've refined our wetland delineation and land cover refinements. The Corps required updated information from the original Merced Fresno EIR EIS document. There's been changes to CEQA thresholds not consistent with our environmental methods, that we address that. Revisions to impact avoidance minimization measures that we learned from CP1. So we took lessons learned of our EIR EIS mitigation measures and refined them forward on those lessons learned. There's also been refinements to PG&E electrical interconnection and networks upgrades analysis that required that. We've also had continued work in environmental justice topic with the area of Fairmead and looked at other mitigation measures for them. We also increased the overall schedule based on the delays and the reviews and the change in the overall approach. Some other considerations that we have is the changes to the Y result in the need to modify the RC scope and contract, since these changes are expansions of their current scope. And this expansion will be for time and money. So this advanced amount, this plus or minus $3 million, will get us to the ultimate rods for this section, including the Surface Transportation Board rod. So we'll get finality with this proposed approach. We also have, during the period of time in this last year, we've had negotiations with FRA on durations of review times, and where we're trying to streamline or do concurrent reviews. We've also come to an agreement with them currently on review times that are consistent and we can apply to all the sections now, versus a unending time frame, which depending on the ability of our staff and the FRA to review these documents. So with that, I'd like to finish my presentation, and if there's any questions with anybody that they may have on the why.
Director Pasquette. Microphone.
Mark, can you hear me? In your comments, you'd mentioned a number of items, including environmental justice work, and on page 4, I think you have a paragraph. Can you just tell me a little bit more about that work?
Sure. Diana Gomez has led the conversations with the town of Fairmead and in what their requirements may be for our alignments and what their needs are. And I think I've been involved in the Y for 5 years, including meeting with Fairmead, and Diana's been more focused on the ground with that group, including our engineering team and environmental team. And so we're trying to work out different ways that the project can be accommodated in their area. Pretty detailed.
Give me an example. What does that mean?
Well, I think they have certain needs that they have, certain improvements to their community they'd like to see. Visual and aesthetics, of course, is a big thing, depending on the alternative. They have civic needs that they would like to address, whether it's their community center. They have infrastructure needs, things like that, that are important to them that they currently don't have. So Diana's been doing a good job with them and meet with them frequently. I'm not sure if any other board members have met with them at all.
I'm meeting with them tomorrow. I'm going to Fairmead tomorrow.
Yep. When I have met with them, they're very professional people. They're very focused on their community at heart, and that's the very important thing to recognize.
Okay, other questions coming down this way?
Oh, just the same issue, that I mentioned before, and a little bit concerned. Can you just expand a little bit on the T.Y. Lin contract?
Sure. as you pointed out, the dollars are coming from the existing TY Lynn contract, which is Bakersfield to Palmdale, which is including the Fresno Bakersfield LGA, locally generated.
Are they reducing their scope? Are we going to get?
That one, their scope is not reduced as they're moving forward to get to the document. They have somewhat over or contingency dollars in there that we found that could be applied here, and they will not reduce their scope.
So we can look forward to having you or someone coming before us and asking for an amendment in the future for the TY Lynn contract, is it?
No, not currently at this time.
Yeah? Okay.
We believe we have enough budget in that
Okay.
in that contract.
Other questions? Pleasure of the board. Moved by Director Pascat. Seconded by Director Rossi. Secretary, please call the roll.
Director Schenk,
Yes.
Vice Chair Richards,
Yes.
Director Rossi, Director Pascat, Director Lowenthal,
Yes.
Director Camacho,
No.
Director Miller, Chair Richard.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, next we'll have presentation on the 2017-2018 business plan by Paula Rivera. Oh, you don't look like Paula Rivera. Well, if you needed to introduce it, Russ, that's fine.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I came
There's another item
Yeah,
first.
I just remembered
Russ,
that.
yeah.
So
I think
Eileen
Paul
Rivera
goes
standing
first.
up here. Go ahead.
Okay.
There's another item?
Yeah, well,
No,
Paul has a report on
Russ
audit.
just jumped the gun.
Sorry.
Ms. Rivera's going to demonstrate leaning in. Not.
Good
Okay.
morning. Sorry, I'm Paula Rivera. I'm the auditor for the High Speed Rail Authority, and I'm here today, to bring the internal quality self-assessment of our quality assurance plan and the audit plan for this fiscal year to you. By way of background, we have a quality assurance program that we've developed for our audit office. It's documented in our audit manual, and each year we do a self-assessment of how we meet those standards we've set for ourselves. And every 3 years, we have an external review of that. So this year in April, we had the external review. So this internal self-assessment that we're bringing you is just sort of that gap period. I'm proud to say that we've made a lot of improvement since the self-assessment we did last year. And audit standards require that I bring this to the board for your acknowledgement of how we're meeting our quality assurance program. I also bring to you the audit plan for the 17-18 year. If you have any questions about the plan, I can let you know how it was developed, some topics, that sort of information. But I ask that you acknowledge the self-assessment and approve our audit plan.
Is there anything in the audit plan that you particularly want to highlight, or does it stand on its own?
It is as much fun as an auditor can imagine.
Director Schenk.
Yeah, thanks. Paula, so just that I know you answered this on the call, but the 1 through 17 is your priority list of how these audits will be covered, and they will all be covered?
Yes.
Yeah, and you have the resources that you need for this?
We were allocated the budget for those resources. However, we have 2 vacancies that we are actively working to fill. This plan is based on being fully staffed. And we had interviews last Friday, a couple of good candidates, and hopefully we will be fully staffed soon.
Okay. And I know you report this to Finance and Audit, but would you let us know, the full board, when you have fully staffed up?
Yes.
That you're still on track to cover all of these?
Yes.
Because I have particular interest in ones that are sort of 6, 7, 8, so they're further down the list.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
I will do. Thank you.
Other questions for Ms. Rivera? Mr. Rossi.
Hi, Paul. So as you've been here for this meeting, and you saw the 3 agenda items, clearly there's something about budgeting that we need to focus on. Are you going to be auditing the system by which these things get approved and keep, in effect, addressing Ernie's question is, something's happening here that sort of could be because we didn't know enough at the time, but there's sort of a systemic issue there. Will you be examining those, auditing those issues in the future? I.e., did they have the appropriate approvals? Was the stuff done in a manner that is reflective of the appropriate analysis? All of those things.
That, we have an audit of contract management on the plan, and we will cover those things. We also have an audit of contract execution, and one of the things we will look at is the initial estimate.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, other questions? Okay, I'm sorry, Director Lowenthal had a question.
Yeah, just looking at the plan as it goes forward, is it possible for us to get reports as you finish each item, as opposed to the final report?
Yes. We issue report, as we finish each audit, we issue the report to the Finance and Audit Committee, and it gets presented in that month's meeting. And I can share copies of the final reports with the full board.
I'm glad to hear that, because it seems to me that some of these items are very relevant to the conversations that we've had on the previous items.
Okay, great. Okay, I believe that the item was moved by Director Schenk. Is there a second? Second by Director Rossi for the approval of the audit plan for the coming year. Would the Secretary please call the roll?
Director Schenk?
Yes.
Vice Chair Richards?
Yes.
Director Rossi?
Yes.
Director Paskett? Director Lowenthal?
Yes.
Director Camacho?
Yes.
Director Miller? Chair Richard?
Yes. So Paula, when Stephen Curry puts up a shot and he knows it's going to go and he walks away, I saw you just walked away from the podium before the vote was even done. That's a lot of confidence there. Very good. Okay, next item is presentation of Finance and Audit Committee reports. Mr. Fong.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, board members, interim CEO, Mr. Falens, Russ Fong, your Chief Financial Officer, and I apologize for the mix-up earlier today. We're going to go through the first set of slides relatively quickly because all the data does appear on our Finance and Audit Committee board reports that come out monthly. So with that, let me go ahead and get started. We'll talk about the financial office and our budgets, accounting, reporting, commercial, and especially our contract management office. This slide basically answers the question, how are we doing paying our invoices? I just wanted to point out that over this fiscal year 10-11 to current, we've decreased our late penalty payments by 99.9%, which is a big accomplishment. This slide just talks about our cash, as we have talked about earlier today. We do monitor our cash. Prop 1A cash as of today is $1.2 billion. Moving over to our cap and trade, our current cash balance is $541 million. Moving over to our admin budget, just for those that aren't familiar, this is our budget that pays our salary, wages, IT, travel, training, facilities, and et cetera. This displays a 3-year period of time and how our budget has changed. Past 2 years, and then obviously our new budget for fiscal year 17 and 18. During the reorg, we pulled out IT and out of admin. We eliminated the strategic office, and our regional director's office merged into program delivery. This slide is the same, but this is where we're spending our money by line item. We've had a 3% increase from the prior year, and we currently have 226 positions established. This highlights our admin budget, our last slide, and basically shows our position growth over 13-14 to the current year. We started at 174 positions, and like I said, we have 226 as of today. Moving over to our capital outlay budget, we have a decrease of 26% from the previous year. This budget is in line with the 2016 business plan and to prioritize our executed contracts to complete the Central Valley segment, both development and construction, our valley to valley, and also our local assistance known as our bookends. Expenditures were under budget for two main reasons. Project development was 55% under budget due to extension of the ROD dates, and our construction was 42% under budget due to delays in right-of-way acquisition and our delays in the weather. This slide highlights our actual expenditures from fiscal year 2006. As you can see, this project has spent $3.7 billion. If you look at in our forecast, we will be projected to spend $5.4 billion. Slide highlights our expenditures and forecast funding by funding source. Our Prop 1A is highlighted in blue, our ARA in purple, and our cap and trade in green. Again, all this information is in our board reports. I just want to highlight our grants team. They are responsible for the financial tracking and reporting of our grant. Our grant is $2.553 billion. And we also have our upcoming FY10 grant of $929 million. Just wanted to point out, as of this week, we've spent 99.9% of our ARA funds. We literally have $14,000 remaining. So how many contracts do we have? As of July 14, we had 137 for about $2.3 billion. Today we have over 400 at $5.6 billion. Looking at our projects initiatives report, we are currently actively monitoring and reporting monthly to the F&A committee 45 critical projects and initiatives. I am excited about our new business and economics branch. They're going to be focusing on doing fiscal and economic impact reports and also job and housing reports. Moving over to our funding for the Central Valley segment, I just wanted to point out that our Central Valley segment has an $8 billion appropriation. Currently, year to date, we spent $3.4 billion, as it's displayed here. We have $4.6 billion appropriations remaining, and today we have the $2.1 billion in cash. But during the bond sales, as the program moves forward, we'll be selling more bonds to actually match what we need. Now, I'm real excited about this slide. I do want to spend a little time on our contract management office. A big part of what we do, our office has been fully staffed for about a year now, and I would personally believe in state service, our contract management office is state-of-the-art. We've centralized approximately 40% of all contract management activities. This gives the contract managers more time to better manage their contracts. A big part of what we do is training on how to effectively manage our contracts. In 2017, we had a total of 26 training classes, and we have about 22 more scheduled. The bottom portion shows our policies and procedures. I'm proud to present that 100% of our contract managers have signed off on their policies and procedures, and also the roles and responsibilities, which I'll be highlighting in the next two slides here. Finally, our CMO team also they do manage two of our critical contracts. One is the RDP contract at $700 million, and the other one is our Finance and Audit Committee, the Finance Advisor, not to exceed $40 million. Here's a summary of our performance for the RDP contract. Once the 2018 business plan is completed, we'll be entering in a work plan 3. This next slide shows the RDP's performance on the budget versus invoice. And this one shows the RDP's performance on the delivering of their plan. Currently, they've delivered 173 completed deliverables, which is slightly below the plan of 200. By the end of the month, and in some of the discussions we've had today, we will have a monthly cost performance trends and variance report for all the major contracts, and this will centralize the monitoring of the burn rate, which will help some of the situations we find ourselves in today. Finally, the Business Oversight Committee. This is a brand new committee. We just finished our charter. This committee, which will introduce a commercial and business discipline within the organization. What you're looking at here is our guiding principles. It's consistent. Are these items consistent with the 2016 business plan? Are funding sources aligned with the funding positions and priorities of the organization? Is there a sound business case and value for money? And are assured that proper review by all key areas. Here are the steps to develop the business case. We assess the business case alignment with the guiding principles, and then the CFO will make a recommendation to the CEO, and if appropriate, will go to a board for approval. And then finally, I wanted to highlight some of the cost reduction initiatives we currently have going on in the finance office. They're basically broken up into 4 categories. We have estimating strategies, cost savings, value engineering, cost deferral, cost avoidance, and finally, scope change. With that, I'd like to conclude my presentation and turn it over to Paula. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Questions for Mr. Fong? That's good. Did you? Well, I couldn't tell from your smile whether you were happy or wanting to ask a question. Microphone.
Rossi doesn't have any, so I'll go ahead and anyway. As I was reading the materials in the last couple of days for the board meeting, I did notice this new commercial office, and you touched on it, and so that's interesting to me and somewhat encouraging. And maybe you can give a little bit more information. Are you taking a new strategy with the projects so that you layer on top of it a business case analysis before there's a green light to proceed?
Correct. It's a couple of roles. One is obviously the budget scope changes. All that will go through a scrutinies and analysis on should we do this. A part of the challenges we had with the 3 agenda items you just saw today was we have a set budget. The budget's already spent. So if something's more priority 1 than something else, then we take the money and move it over. With the Business Oversight Committee, will validate that one that's occurring, but also start asking those questions that you asked today. What happens to that other contract that just got their scope reduced? We'll dive into that, but also to look at a more commercial business discipline. We have to get our arms around this project has to make money. And so how we build it, we just want to look at another set of lens, and also everything that goes to the board will have to run through this committee first, hopefully to answer some of those questions that came out today. So it's really to emphasize a financial and a commercial discipline within the organization.
Which is very encouraging that that's a concept that's going to be introduced. And then I only have one other question, and it's you had a lot of information that you presented in a short amount of time, so I'm very impressed. You did mention that you're going to have a contract review process and related it back to a lot of our questions today. Is that a new process, or you're going to?
It's a new process. The contract management office has been around for about a year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
Just been fully staffed recently. Okay. One of the things that we want to manage is help the contract managers manage their burn rate. Check a look at their variances and the trends on what they're spending their money on, so we don't come to the board and say we need funds and we need it by the next month. It's to help prevent that and help support the contract managers so that we're making sure that we're spending the money in an appropriate fashion, but also and within the guidelines of the contracts.
So those are 2 very encouraging changes, Mr. Chair, and I don't know if that's due to your leadership or collective leadership, but it's nice to see those 2 items.
No, I'm certainly not going to take credit for it. I think that the staff, well, I would also say finance and audit has been driving a lot of this, but, you know, Mike Rossi said for a long time that our motto should be that we're not building a railroad, we're building an enterprise. Because the law requires that this has to operate without an ongoing operating subsidy. So I think anything that, you know, there are a lot of decisions that have been made. A lot of people are empowered to make decisions around the program, but those decisions can have impacts on the ultimate enterprise value. So I like this, like you, I like this approach very much.
I do.
Because I think what it does is it interposes a management structure that says, these decisions are going to be looked at through the filter of not just short-term impacts on cost and so forth, but the longer-term impacts on the program's economic viability. And I think that's very good that we have the leadership team focused on that. And so I really give credit to Tom Falens, the interim CEO, and the executive leadership team which includes Russ Fong and John Tapping and Roy Hill as the Chief Program Delivery Officer. And, I think this Business Oversight Committee is a very good.
It's a great idea, Russ and Tom, and it's nice to see this development in a short amount of time.
Great. Other questions for Mr. Fong?
Thank you.
I have.
Yes, I'm sorry, Ms. Miller, excuse me. I didn't mean to miss you.
Thank you. No, that's all right. First of all, I want to thank you for briefing me ahead of time, and for the rest of the staff, Tom and Mark and John and others. I just have one question on just who, and I'm sure you have this, but it's the procurement satisfaction. In other words, that because this is a construction project, as concrete's delivered and rebar and all those kinds of things, you have an oversight construction manager who's checking specs on all of that.
Yes, we do. This is probably a question a little bit out of my element, but I know we do.
Oh, I'm sure it's not.
As
Fire
Chief
away.
Financial Officer, I'm going to turn around and probably look, but.
We have
Or maybe I'll ask this after to whoever the appropriate person is, just because it helps for your business financial in the future if you've got a project that's been built to
We
spec.
do have a quality assurance team.
Right.
And actually, Mr. Tapping is going to present next.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dan, I'm sorry, I had one more. It's more ticky-tacky, and we can address this at the next board meeting, and it's probably something for Tom. So in the deck on page 31, there's a pay-go bullet for cap and trade out through 2030.
Right.
And so I didn't follow it that closely, but with the extension, doesn't it require 2/3 approval in future years just for the expenditure, or did I get that wrong?
No, my understanding is that as part of the agreement, in the legislative agreement on cap and trade, well,
Maybe.
actually, I'm sitting here.
Staring at our
Perhaps
expert.
we have a subject matter expert on the board who could speak to this, but Dr. Arambula, do you want me to give my description, or do you want to do it? Okay, I apologize, that was not appropriate. So my understanding is that in the agreement that was reached, it was agreed that a ballot measure would be put before the public on the 2018 June ballot that would provide that in 2024, and only in 2024, there would be if the ballot measure passed, that it would require that in 2024, the expenditure plan for that year would require a 2/3 vote. My further understanding is that every year before and after that, it would be a majority vote of the legislature as to the expenditure plan.
That was my
So
question.
It's sort of like a fire break, if you will. I think it was the thinking on the part of the members of the other party who wanted that. So, Assembly Member, how'd I do with that?
That sounds correct.
Okay.
Because he didn't say it was correct.
No. He also didn't say it with the microphone on, so let the record show. The Assembly Member said that what I just said was correct.
So Russ, that was to put it in pay-go with the chair's explanation. I'm now more comfortable. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, I think the market's going to look at that, and they'll have to wait and see whether the ballot measure passes. But until it does, they probably look at that and assume that it is not conducive to financing. Right.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. Other questions? Okay. Thank you. Thanks very much, Russ. I know a lot of work went into all that, so that's good. Ms. Rivera, you're back.
I'm back. And I have 2 slides that identify audit reports that we've issued since our last update, and then I have 2 slides that talk about audits that we're working on right now. So if you have any questions, feel free to slow me down. We issued a report on design build oversight. The scope was to see if the risk model of authority, design acceptance, and oversight is being maintained, and we just looked at CP1. We found that there had been a lot of progress from when we started the audit to when we finished the audit, and we recommend that lessons learned be compiled and used in subsequent CP, or construction packages, sorry. We completed an audit of third-party agreements and how those contracts are managed, and we found that the invoicing on some of those third-party agreements did not allow the contract manager to identify the work that had been performed and whether or not it was actually necessary. We also found that the contract manager could be doing other alternative analysis, and so we recommended that they look at some other ways to assure the work's been done. We completed our first incurred cost audit, a contract compliance audit. We looked at the costs that were billed and reimbursed and determined that there were some costs that did not comply with the terms of the agreement, but it was 0.4%. So we found some money that needed to be repaid, but we don't have any overall concerns on how our largest contracts for A&E, within the A&E services are being managed. We did a pre-award review, which is the review we do of contracts that are awarded based on qualifications only. We take a look at the cost proposed before the contract is executed to be sure that it's based on actual labor rates, current overhead rates, and actual other direct costs. We completed an audit on third-party estimating, the process that the regional consultants and the RDP are using to estimate third-party costs. And we found that they had some areas that would improve their process, but we didn't find anything that we highlighted as a flaw in their process. We also finished an audit on the project construction management materials oversight.
Excuse me 1 second, Ms. Rivera.
Yes.
Just on that one, we have some experience with third-party contracts, and of course those contracts have come in higher than estimated before. So I guess my question is, you looked at their processes.
Yes.
I think I know the answer to this, but were you able to go back and look at, was there anything from your work that gives us any insight into why we missed some of those costs early on? I mean,
it seems to have been due to the granularity with which the estimate was developed. At the 15% design, the estimates are created, and that's not based on very detailed information. And then as the estimates progressed, there was not that additional granularity added into the estimates.
So for your purposes, for looking at their processes, you identified some areas where those could be improved, but maybe this is a little outside your area, but I mean, how much do you think that will improve the forecasting of these costs?
They feel like it will greatly improve the forecasting of the costs. Right now there's a general, is it rural, is it agricultural, is it housing? So there's some generalities that are applied to those third-party costs, and to use specific parcels or whether or not we're going to have alternate technical concepts, viaducts, above ground, using that additional information will get better estimates.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
And then we also completed an audit on the project construction management materials oversight, which is what you were asking, Director Miller. We have a project construction management contract, a firm for each design build contract that is working with the authority as the oversight of that. And we just looked at their materials oversight and whether or not the materials the design builder is using meet the standards and specifications. So that was this specific audit. And so we found there were some procedural things that the authority can do better to manage those contracts.
Thank you.
Sure. Audits in progress. We're looking at the right-of-way critical parcel acquisition process. All right-of-way parcels are not equal in their priorities, and so we're looking to see the process that they use to prioritize those parcels. We're looking at the design change process, whether or not the steps that they perform and the order in which they perform those steps are the most economical and efficient use of that process. We're looking at project controls. We're looking at current policies and practices for project controls, including schedule management and cost management. I'm finalizing a small business follow-up review on the source of the information for the small business reports that the authority prepares. We're working on an audit of the hiring process, if there are any economies and efficiencies that we can find in that process, and that's specifically for state staff. We also have a contract compliance and incurred cost audit going on to see if the contractors complied with the contract provisions and specifically federal cost principles. So that's what we have going on right now. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Paula. Any
Thank you.
questions from anybody? Thank you. Scott?
Good morning, members of the board. My name's Scott Jarvis. I'm the chief engineer for the authority, and I'm going to give a very quick program delivery status update. And I'm going to focus on project delivery. We've talked about some of the challenges that we've had today. I'll also talk about the corrective actions that we're taking. I'll touch on the audit responses that Paula just went through, and then I'll also give a project delivery update on some of the main functional areas of our project delivery program. So I'll start with contingency management. We've had quite a bit of discussion on that this morning. And so, you know, obviously contingencies needed to cover the unknowns on the project. There's a lot of information on this slide, but really what it focuses on is what is our process, how we inform the Finance and Audit Committee, what the CEO is authorized to do. And I think what's really important is that bottom bullet. Contingency management is directly related to change control, and we've had some discussions on that today as our ability to manage change on the projects, and especially related to additional scope that's added through various means and added to our contracts. That's been a real challenge for us as far as staying in the budget within our projects. So as far as just real briefly, on talking on contingency CP1, we had a discussion on that this morning, but you know, really to summarize at a very high level, the challenge that we had was we delivered projects to construction very, very early in the project development process, even for the design build model. We didn't have right-of-way, we didn't have railroad agreements, we didn't have most of the other third-party agreements, we didn't have some of the key environmental permits, and we had very little information on utilities. So obviously a lot of challenges that the team has had to deal with and work their way through. The positive side of doing that is we have really advanced this program. There is a lot of construction going on the 119 miles down in the Central Valley, especially on the CP1, about 31 miles of construction at various locations. But there has been a cost to that, and there has been challenges of risks that the authority retained and took into construction and has led to some major change orders. Now, we did follow up with CP2 and CP4. They followed shortly after CP1, but we were able to incorporate some lessons learned into CP2 and CP4 related to the contingency assessment as detailed there. One of the major things that we did, as you see on the far right there, is that we used a 90% confidence level on CP23 and CP4, and on CP1 we used a 50% confidence level. But like I said, CP23 and CP4 followed closely after CP1, so a lot of those challenges that we've had on CP1, we also have on CP23 and CP4, but we actively manage and mitigate those challenges to the extent that we can. So at a very big picture, what were some of our initial challenges? You know, it really gets down to the big three: organizational challenges, policies and procedures, tools and systems. When we went out to construction, we essentially were a planning organization. We'd been working many years on planning and environmental clearance processes, and we went to construction very quickly. And so during that period, now we are working on corrective actions. We've implemented many corrective actions. We continue to implement them as we continue to improve. One is organizational. We've talked about some organizational changes this morning, but one of the main ones is we've transitioned to more of a project management organization. To successfully manage construction projects, the management has to take place, boots on the ground where the work is taking place. And so we've really worked towards implementing that project management organization, and even more so a task management organization where you drill down into the major tasks of the project, have clear responsibility and accountability. Policies and procedures, we've transitioned, we've developed many policies and procedures now related to project delivery, as outlined there. And tools and systems. We've been able to advance many of our tools and systems that we didn't have when we originally went out to construction. One of them is the Project Management Information System. We are making progress on that, sometimes not as fast as we would like, but there are some of the major modules that have made some really good progress on our PMIS. And the second to the bottom bullet is really important, the Resource Loaded Master Program Schedule that we are working on now to really define our plan moving forward. And really that helps us to manage the program with that resource-loaded master schedule. But very important at a project level is then use that information to develop detailed project work plans. Again, to be successful, you have to manage at the project level. So you have to have that clear work plans in place, who does what, by when, within what resources. And as you can see, there's a lot of other continuous improvements that we have accomplished and continue to focus on in the program delivery area. But what I do want to draw your attention to is the last bullet, which is advancing project development for San Jose to Merced section, or just all future contracts. And we are advancing engineering and geotechnical investigations, environmental permits right away to the extent that we can, surveying and mapping as we go through the process of delivery. And get a preferred preliminary alignment, we'll be able to advance right away even more, and our third-party agreements. So we are moving forward on a lot of those functional areas that we had not advanced before going to construction in the Central Valley. So I'm going to touch on audits that Paula went through, and I want to say that we really welcome the work that Paula does. Her and her team do a great job, and they help us focus. They help us understand some areas where we need to improve, so it's an opportunity for us to continually improve our processes. So Paula touched on these areas. I will just say for each of them, we read through the recommendations very carefully, we develop an action plan, and we manage those action plans for each of the audits. Now I'm going to transition into project development, or the preliminary engineering and the environmental phase. Very big picture is that as part of this project management organization, we have adjusted schedules and costs to reflect the current environmental clearance plans. We continue to focus on the very important environmental clearance section, Silicon Valley to Central Valley line. But while doing all of that, we're keeping the statewide perspective in mind while efficiently using our resources. We have limited resources, so we want to make sure that we're efficiently focusing them on the most important environmental clearance areas. As far as our major accomplishments to date, we have those two major section clearances in the Central Valley, which has enabled us to go to construction. We've also environmentally cleared the electrical interconnections, and we continue to work closely with our stakeholders, FRA, and cooperating agencies to expedite the reviews and clearance. And Mark talked about some of those in more detail in some specific sections. I'm just going to go through these slides very quickly. The Central Valley is where we're the most far along on our environmental clearance, and we continue to work on 3 major environmental documents as described there. Northern California, this is a very high priority for us. Including the San Francisco to San Jose section. We have Caltrain construction ongoing in this section. So it's from a schedule standpoint, it's very important for us to advance our environmental clearance there and coordinate with that Caltrain construction work that's going on. And as mentioned, the San Jose to Merced, we've talked about that earlier this morning and the importance of that section. The Southern California section, we're working on 4 major environmental clearance documents. And we're at the stage where we're performing the preliminary engineering. We're working towards the project definition as we work to a preferred preliminary alignments within those 4 sections. Right-of-way. Been a lot of talk on right-of-way. We're aware of a lot of right-of-way challenges that we have had, continue to have, but I do want to mention that there has been significant progress, tremendous right-of-way acquisition. We have acquired and transferred to our contractors over 1,100 parcels. So a huge right-of-way program, a lot of progress. However, primarily due to the slow start, the acquisition lags behind the original plan. That's part of the risk that I talked about earlier that the authority retains. We gave our bidders some dates with right-of-way. We haven't met all of those, so we continue to have some construction delay, cost exposure with right-of-way. But with the advancement, right-of-way is no longer on the critical path for construction on CP1. There's 13 locations under construction and more starting, so that's very good news. And we have focused on CP2 and 3 and CP4 on really the critical parcels so the contractor can start and continue construction. And from a right-of-way perspective, we do have areas where the contractor can go to work on CP2, 3, and CP4. So we do have some progress there. Now, in the Central Valley, the majority of the parcels, the original parcels that have not been acquired yet, are in the eminent domain process. So it's very important that we try to quickly go through that process. In a way that we do that is obtaining orders of possession so the contractor can go to work even if we don't have full ownership of the parcel. So accomplishments, I go into some details on each of the contracts, but the high-level summary is as I described it. Working on CP1 in many locations and have locations on 2, 3, and 4 where the work can start. Now, I'm not going to get into the details here, but if you like graphs, there's all kinds of numbers here. I will just summarize, though. At the top, the dark blue is the original plan, and this is CP1. There had been changes. There's been a scheduled cost increase, so that plan is changed, and the yellow is our alternative plan that we have established, and we're very close as far as in the numbers to the alternative plan that we established back in 2015. And our brown is where we're at, and you can see 644 to 677. We're pretty close to where we predicted we would be back in 2015. This is for the northern extension part of CP1, the north part of the project, and you can see with the brown line being above the blue, we've consistently stayed above the plan in that area of the project. This is for CP23. The green is the original acquisition plan. Now, what occurs is there's a lot of design changes. They're primarily contractor-requested design changes for right-of-way. And so that gives, contractually, it gives the authority additional time. We have additional 12 months. So that's really what that pink line represents, is that rebaselining based upon changes to the contract, primarily contractor-requested changes. And then the brown is where we're at compared to that plan. So fairly close, but we are lagging behind. But again, the focus has been on critical areas to get the contractor to construction. CP4, we are ahead of that changed plan related to right-of-way, but behind the original acquisition plan. Third-party agreements, it's the next major functional area I want to talk about. Overall, we've made some very good progress in the area of utilities. There are certain utilities, AT&T, PG&E, level 3 communications, where we've set aside provisional sums. It wasn't part of the contractor's bid, so that is a risk that the authority retains. Progress is continuing. There has been cost pressure in this area, especially related to the PG&E relocations, primarily on CP1. So we've worked to establish some improvements, including a coordinated monthly meeting. We analyze the past bid results, looking for ways to more efficiently procure and complete this work, including working with PG&E and AT&T for more vendors to increase the competition That's what drives prices down is competition. And as far as the policies and procedures, we're developing a best practices manual to guide the future third-party coordination. So here's a high-level summary of the status of the master agreements for third-party. If you look at the total there, the second from the right, we have executed 127 of the master third-party agreements that have been identified. 102 have not been executed. But then if you look over at the far left, you see, like, for example, in the Central Valley, where 90 have been executed, 10 are unexecuted. So significant progress where the work is going on. And then if you look to the far right, we've also been focusing on the valley to valley. And as you can see, 100 executed, 33 non-executed. So this really reflects the areas that we focus on negotiating and execution of the third-party agreements based upon where the work is being performed. As far as the construction summary, there's significant field activity on CP1. We have some limited field activities on CP23. CP4 is primarily in the design phase. We do anticipate more extensive construction plan as far as starting on CP23 and CP4 later this year. We do continue to see risk using our risk models of looking forward and identifying risks, primarily due to additional costs through railroad agreements, third-party infrastructure, right-of-way delays, and utility relocation. That's really the big four. But as we look forward and see those risks, we're able to mitigate and manage to the extent that we can. So we're really focused. We understand the context of delivering that Central Valley as it fits into the overall V to V. So I'll just kind of skip through here because these get through some details as far as accomplishments. CP1, as you can see, there's a listing there of 13 active construction sites that are ongoing, and we're also starting construction in 4 other areas. So really some great progress on CP1. CP23 has been more on the design and the design related activities, clearing and grubbing, demolition, geotechnical exploration for design. And again, we expect construction to ramp up starting later this year. I do want to say that on CP23 we have received some significant cost and time extension claims that have been submitted by the contractor, and executive leadership is involved in that to develop strategies moving forward. CP4 overall has been going well. It was our last contract, but if the schedule goes planned, they will begin construction at a couple of overpass locations prior to the end of this year. Critical issues and mitigating actions. We've had the critical issues with right-of-way, and again, the real focus there is the critical parcels, getting the parcels needed for construction. Utility conflicts and relocation, I've touched on that and some of the improvements we've made. Railroad intrusion protection barrier requirements, that's a change to our contract for the most part. There was a smaller amount that was bid upon. Most of it has changed, so we're working with the railroads and the contractor to come up with more cost-efficient ways of, instead of the concrete intrusion protection barrier. And northern extension work, we're looking at ways of how can we really efficiently deliver this work. It's being done by change order. We believe that we could probably get some more competitive prices through a competitive bidding process. So we're looking at some alternatives there as far as where we can maybe cut that work off and look to competitively bid for future work on the north extension. One of the major changes we did make in the design, though, is we revised the alignment to avoid the need for an intrusion protection barrier. So that was a significant savings in the range of about $40 million on the north extension. CP23 critical issues, again, there's really a consistent theme throughout the Central Valley. Railroad issues, right-of-way, and again, we're really focused on executive partnering on CP23 to work through some of those major challenges. CP4, railroad intrusions for additional cost pressures, some right-of-way parcel delay, not as significant as CP1 and CP23. So this is a lot of details kind of showing where we're at on the contingency on the projects. I'll just say if you go to the far right, you can see we're at 6% in July on CP1, which is low. We want to be 10% or more, and that's part of why we had the board items today for shifting of funds to provide some additional funding for change order work. CP1 schedule, we are ahead of the rebaseline schedule based upon the time extension that has been provided to the contractor. CP23 contingency, plenty of money in the contingency at this point, but as we look forward, we do see some significant risks on CP23. And CP23 is behind. The blue is the contractor's original schedule. This is based upon the amount of work that they've performed, the earned value, and you can see that they're behind their original plan, but close to what we had predicted based upon a forecast that we had established in June. And CP4, if you look on the far right, you see 15% contingency. So again, we do have some significant money in the contingency on CP4, but there are risks that we're managing that I outlined. But CP4 is probably the contract we feel the most comfortable about this time from a financial management standpoint. And CP4 is behind their original plan, but with construction starting later this year, we expect that brown forecast line to be moving up sharply to ultimately intersect with the plan. Okay, so with that, that's a very high-level trip through program delivery status, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Just right at the end on CP4, it was moving pretty fast, but I thought the contract amount was 446, but it looked like the estimate at the end on the right was 453. Is that a discrepancy that?
Well, that would include the change order amount.
Okay.
Ultimately, yeah. So.
And is that an approved change order or an anticipated change order?
I believe that's approved. Yes.
Okay. Other questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Camacho.
You glossed over CP23. What is the magnitude of the problems that there is in terms of dollars?
Their claims are hundreds of millions of dollars.
I'm sorry?
Hundreds of millions of dollars is their claim amount. So they're major issues that we're dealing with. Of course, many of them are in dispute, and that's why we're going through the process of resolution.
Can I suggest that
I'm sorry.
This probably is something, I just want to say that some of this I think probably ought to be discussed in closed session because it's a matter of claims and potential litigation. And I think that you should get all the answers that you want to get. But I do think that some of this we should probably.
I just want to couch the question in terms of, are we in fact looking at mitigating this current time?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it falls into two categories. One is, what do we think the cost should be, and what do they think the cost should be? Of course. So I think those numbers are far apart at this moment. All right. Other questions? Okay, thank you. Thanks, Scott.
You're welcome. All right, I'll turn it over to John.
Yeah.
Quick comment. This might have been more instructive for me anyway to hear this presentation, or maybe it's Tom, before the contract vote.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you're saying. It would have been.
Maybe in the future when we have these presentations, if it makes sense on the agenda to front load it and to give us context as board members prior to voting on some of the contract changes.
Oh, to have this presentation before, right, okay.
Right.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. I think we generally try to arrange the agenda so that we get action items first in case board members have to leave, but there should be exceptions to that, and I understand what you're saying. So that's worthy of consideration.
Good.
Okay.
I think it may be afternoon, but John Tapping, back at you.
It may well be, yeah. There's a risk that it's afternoon already, yes.
90% probable. I'm here in my risk management capacity as part of the Finance and Audit Committee briefing that we do routinely. I wanted to go in a slightly different direction. because of my acting assignment of Chief Operating Officer, has opened the door really to a lot of organizational issues and risks that we've been facing. We have been tracking organizational risks and monitoring them, but it's with our executive committee, with Russ Fong and Tom, we've been given the opportunity, I think, to make some real change, and we have already made some real change with the organization and how we run the organization. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the risks, organizational risks, and what we're doing to mitigate the organizational risks as we move forward in managing this program. This is basically just your 5-quadrant standard risk process. You identify them, prioritize, analyze, manage, monitor, and control. And so as a risk manager, we do that with the cost and schedule risks. We run the complicated Monte Carlo analyses, get a level of confidence, but we also do it on a qualitative basis with a number of risks, including organizational risks. So when we look at our program, we have definitely the project delivery risk that Scott talked about in detail today, programmatic risks that span over all of the projects, and organizational risks. So some of the enterprise or organizational risks that we've identified through various processes in the past are integration of all of our functional units. Some people call them silos or cylinders of excellence. As we've grown rapidly, we've been maturing lately, and we've done a reorganization that breaks down some of these barriers. Let's move on. I think Scott touched upon, I just wanted to drive home again that we do the quantitative and project level risk management. This is, I think Scott spoke to a lot of these in his presentation, so I'm going to move on to organizational risk. So we have a number of initiatives that we have done over the last year or so. We've got quality process assessments where we look at things like communication, roles, accountability, who's responsible, who's accountable, and basically looking at who makes decisions and how are our decisions sustainable. We've done surveys and we've done evaluations, and so we've identified basically our risk drivers as integration, alignment, roles, responsibilities, requirement clarity, and those other items that you see there. So those have been really the focus of what we're looking at now in our executive committee and how to manage this program moving forward. Really just prioritizing, a lot of it is communication, getting the right people in the right room to make the right decisions at the right time and making sustainable decisions. And these, I want to touch upon the org chart very briefly. So we've reorganized to have, our rail delivery, and you can see there on the bottom, one of the yellow boxes, and infrastructure delivery, as well as Chief Engineer Scott, who is really the custodian of the standards and the policies and the procedures for engineering, and then the support services, which would include project controls. So we've consolidated all those functions under a project delivery office and under myself as the acting Chief Operating Officer. And that's really been an improvement in getting, for example, there's competing values or discussions between infrastructure delivery and rail delivery. And so it has really helped in opening up that communication, and we put in place a committee structure, which I'll talk a little bit about later, which actually feeds into what Russ talked about, the Business Oversight Committee. I'm going to skip through this slide in the interest of time. And so in managing all of these risks, integration, roles, responsibilities, we have a number of initiatives underway. Program review, we've been having workshops in the regions to clarify organizational charts below those yellow pillars, which I showed you on our general organizational chart. Clarifying roles and responsibilities, accountability for who makes decisions, responsibility for carrying out the decisions, and who's consulted and who's informed. So really clarifying how we make decisions as we move forward. I don't want you to think that we're bureaucratic with all these committees, because they're really, we have a program delivery committee, which is all of that program delivery pillars which I mentioned, but we have an operations meeting every week with everyone in the room. And you know, we have action items and papers and decisions that we make through that committee structure. And likewise, we have an executive committee, consists of Tom Falens, myself, and Russ Fong, which basically meets to confer on those executive level decisions that may flow out of the program delivery committee meeting. And as Russ had an excellent presentation on the Business Oversight Committee, one of the things we want to do as we move forward is have a more robust financial and budgeting and change control process. So these are all things that we put in place in the last 2 months. It's been very exciting to be part of this effort and to be given the autonomy, really, to set up this organization in a manner that we think is the best functioning for how we move forward. Moving on to basically, basically that's my discussion on organizational risk. It's fun. We're moving forward. We're making decisions, and it's really been exciting, actually. I've been enjoying it. These are just current other on my risk management role, things that we've been undertaking. We talked about the CP 1 through 4 risk informed and contingency analysis update, which is ongoing. We've started our valley to valley programmatic risk assessment, looking at schedule and applying schedule risks. And there's a lot of support work that you see that we're doing in support of the 2018 business plan. And so that really concludes my presentation, and I'll be happy to take any questions at this point.
Questions for Mr. Tapping? Okay, thank you, John.
Thank you very much.
Sorry. Okay, our last item on the public session is a discussion of the 2018 business plan. Mr. Falens.
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and board members. We're going to have a PowerPoint presentation.
Of course we are.
Okay, just click it. There we go. The 2018 business plan is how we titled this, but we're going to do a little bit more than that. So the purpose of today's briefing is to review the following matters: the statutory requirements for the business plans. We're going to go over 3 prior business plans: 2012, 2014, and 2016. I'm also going to show you the guiding principles and core values that we embodied in the most recent 2016 business plan. What key events have occurred since the 2016 business plan? And then finally, the timeline for developing the draft and final 2018 business plan. The authorities required to prepare, publish, adopt, and submit to the legislature a business plan every 2 years. It's due May 1st of every even year, so it's due in May 1st, 2018. Before submitting the plan to the legislature, the authority must publish a draft, hold a public hearing, and have a 60-day public comment period. So what we plan to do is release that draft in early February to allow the public comment period to transpire, the 60 days, and to allow enough time for us to go to the April board meeting for you to have presented to you for your consideration the approval of the final business plan. At that time, we will also summarize the comments and information that we received from the public during that 60-day period. The Public Utilities Code outlines a series of required elements in the business plan, and I show them here. It has to show a description of the service to be provided, proposed environmental and construction schedules, capital cost estimates, ridership and revenue forecasts, operation and maintenance costs, a break-even analysis, and that's for purposes of complying with Proposition 1A, our bond funding mechanism. And we have to show what the sources of the funding that the authority has and intends to access, and any written agreements that we have with public or private entities to fund system components. We have a requirement to show public-private development strategies for delivering phase one. And then finally, reasonable risks that the project may encounter and how we intend to manage those. Going back to 2012, we wanted to go back to this business plan because this was a significant change or turning point, I believe, for the project. Prior to this, there were business plans, but we had really been purely a planning organization. And in 2012, we now had the potential to have access to large amounts of funds to use for construction to move the project into a completely different position, which we have done. And so I've shown here the 3 stages of phased implementation that we set out in the 2012 business plan. We looked at an initial operating section, north, San Jose to Bakersfield, south, Merced to San Fernando Valley. And the iOS South was identified as the initial operating section that would be the first to be constructed at that time. Although we didn't really have funding outside of the Central Valley identified because the cap and trade program hadn't been implemented, we didn't have funds to build the entire iOS at that time, but we had selected the South as the first one. We also, at this time, created the foundation for what's called a blended strategy, where we integrate at the ends of our system, which we call the Caltrain Peninsula area and the Los Angeles metropolitan area. And we want to integrate the high-speed trains with existing intercity or regional systems, those operated by LA Metro in the south, and then Caltrain in the north. So that was the blended concept that we had placed in this 2012 business plan and carried all through 2016. We also put high-speed rail in context of statewide rail modernization because there's a lot of rail systems existing with the state, and it's important that we connect up with these. There was $950 million of Prop 1A bonds for connectivity projects, which have all been allocated for those projects, and many are underway. But we're building more than just a high-speed rail system. We're building a statewide rail system, and we're part of a statewide rail plan that agency and Caltrans puts out, and you'll see that at the end of this calendar year. We're going to CAHSRA, the transportation agency, is going to put out the statewide rail plan. We also updated ridership and revenue forecasts and cost estimates at that time, and I showed the phase one estimate cost as $64.4 billion at the time. And we had sufficient funding at that time, as I mentioned, to fund the Central Valley. Those 2 funding sources were Prop 1A and federal funds. We also created an initial business model framework that we've continued to use. And we provided the basis for an appropriation in 2012 by SB 1029, where the federal funds that we had through grant programs and the Prop 1A funds for the Central Valley as matching funds were appropriated. Then in 2014, I'm listed here some of the elements of that particular business plan. We reported on our progress since 2012. We continued with this 3-stage phase implementation, an initial operating section, a beta basin, and a phase 1. The statute requires that we report specifically on phase 1, for example, as well as other smaller sections We also updated our forecasts for ridership and had some external reviews by the Union of Railroads, Government Accounting Office, and others. We think this was very important to verify the credibility of the plans that we're putting out. We introduced a risk-based break-even analysis to show financial viability. It's called Monte Carlo approach. And at that time, our capital cost estimate was $67.6 billion. And we had sufficient fundings at that time, again, same as in 2012, to fund the Central Valley construction. But we also were working with the legislature and the governor to become part of the cap and trade program. So we did some important work for advancing that program, which became law, and we received significant funding under that program in the summer of 2014. Then I have a picture here of the 2016 business plan map and some other facts about the 2016 business plan. Again, we updated our forecasts and estimates. We had reduced the capital cost estimate down to 64.2, and we updated funding plan to include now the cap and trade program and the funds that we would be receiving for that under that cap and trade program. We also showed that if the cap and trade program had extended out to 2015 and had a $500 million per year revenue stream to high-speed rail, that we potentially could fund $20.8 billion, assuming also that there was some opportunity to get private financing using that cap and trade revenue. And that would have allowed us to look at the possibility of finishing the valley to valley that we describe in our business plan. That is Silicon Valley to the Central Valley as an operating section. We changed, of course, the implementation strategy to deliver the North first, and that was because of us having a better shot at receiving enough financing to have an operating system at that time. But we emphasize a commitment to make concurrent investments in Southern California between Burbank and the Los Angeles corridor, and we had previously in SB 1029, the legislature had appropriated $500 million for projects along those corridors in the south, recently of which we've had an approval by this board in the Rosecrans-Marquardt to grade separation. And then finally, we reemphasize our commitment to seek additional federal funds. We did develop some guiding principles and core values in the 2016 business plan, so I share those with you for your consideration on continuing to adopt these or to refine them in an appropriate manner. The guiding principles are to fulfill our Prop 1A commitment, to provide for California a true high-speed rail system. I think we just talked about that, the trains that run at the faster speeds, just as set out in statute. And we evaluate new opportunities and adapt to changing circumstances to deliver the system as quickly and efficiently as possible. And we also look to reduce costs and construction time using blended implementation strategies, which I had gone over the blended system. We also, as a guiding principle, match projects with available funding and to deliver them under appropriate business models, and finally advance other strategic early investments with our partners, many of them in the rail transportation business. And we also have, as you see here, the core values, safety and security, partnership with the public and private sector, training and employment opportunities, including disadvantaged workers. We have a robust small business DVBE program, and we also are committing to sustainable land use and economic planning. There's a number of key events since 2016 that I wanted to point out. We've made a lot of progress in construction in the Central Valley, 14 active construction sites. I saw that Scott had put down 13. I guess I'm just updating, and there's 14 now, over 113 miles. The design and environmental clearances have advanced considerably at the project level. The funding plans have been approved by this board for the San Francisco to San Jose Peninsula and Rosecrans Marquardt grade separations. Those unlock Prop 1A funds that this board had committed in both the bookends, north and south. And we initiated a procurement for an early operator. In fact, those proposals for the 4 operators are due today. We also presented to the board just in the last couple months an economic report that shows the significant benefit and economic benefit that this project has had, and it's $2.3 billion have been invested, and that's yield $3.5 to $4 billion in other economic benefits over the 10-year period from 2006 to 2016. We anticipate $2.5 billion of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funds to be fully expended. As Russ had mentioned, we're very close. And we did get this summer, thanks to our legislature, an extension of the cap and trade program to 2030. It had only been out to 2020 previously. And then, I believe this is the last slide. This just shows the development of the draft and final business plan, the timeline verbally described there. And this summer and fall, we've been working on capital cost estimates, operating and maintenance cost estimates, ridership estimates, and we started to draft the plan itself. December and January, we anticipate finalizing all the forecasts of cash flow and continue with the drafting. February, we're going to release the draft. February to April, public comment. April board, present it to the board, including that errata sheet I mentioned to show any technical corrections and also comments from the public that we received in writing, a summary of that. And then finally, if the board approves it, we would submit it to the legislature by the due date, May 1st. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Mr. Falens? Excuse me. Okay. Director Miller?
Just turning it on, there we go. April board meeting, and then you have to submit it to the legislature May 1?
Correct.
Does that allow you enough time, you think, to incorporate if there's questions, or is that?
Yes, it's a mad rush to do that. It will probably be about a 2-week period. So we essentially have a draft. We consider public comments, and to the extent that there are changes that we think are appropriate, we would have a couple versions, possibly the original, and listen to the board's.
In the past, what's happened is that there's been extensive public outreach, and so there's, I think, a statutory requirement for at least one public hearing.
Right.
Which we usually have contemporaneously with a board meeting, but occasionally in the past we've had more than one public hearing because it's
Yes.
the minimum, it's not the maximum. And in 2012, for example, when there were major programmatic changes being suggested, we had several public hearings, we had quite an extensive record of comments. So there was a lot of that was in the run-up between the draft document and the final document. And then many of those were incorporated in what the staff presented to us. But by that time, I think the board had become familiar with the general thinking of the direction of public comments. So it wasn't as though there was some sharp inflection point at the board adoption that then had to get reflected into the final document. Having said that, certainly we want to make sure that the board has ample opportunity to reflect, to direct, and so forth. And I think part of this as well is it gets into production dynamics, which is that, people like to produce a nice readable version of this, but in terms of meeting our statutory requirements to present something to the legislature, it may be that there's enough time to get that done with the polished document following, afterwards.
Okay, so between that, when it's out for public comment, it's obviously a public draft, so you bring it and present it to the board
Yes.
during that time period?
Yes, in February, we'll present
You'll
it to
come,
the board.
thank you.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Director Pascat.
So, Tom, I have more of a statement than a question. At the last approval vote, I was reluctant to support the plan because it de-emphasized the Southern California investments, but I understood why, and it was a difficult but critical decision to do so. So as we start this process and you begin to take in information and suggestions, my hope is that you'll consider the Southern California piece of this, and maybe with all the creativity of the staff and the collective intelligence, there will be opportunities to show more of a benefit for the Southern California portions, particularly with the positive development with cap and trade and that certainty.
Okay, yes, definitely we'll look at all those possibilities.
Other questions? Okay. Thank you very much, Tom. That completes our public agenda. I know it's getting late, but I'm going to suggest that we have a recess to a closed session of the board, at least to address a few items, and after that we will we'll report back. So the board will now enter into closed session in the anteroom off of this main conference room. We'll report back any actions out of the closed session. Thank you all. Completed its closed session. There are no items to report, and with that, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.